I would like to comment specifically, or take as a starting point your correct diagnosis of the problem, which is in page 2 of your motion when you talk about entrenched dysfunctional relationship between the urban sectors. By the way, that issue is a lot bigger than just how do you procure urban design and architectural services in the public sector tender process. That's a very small part of that. But there's a much larger set of issues in terms of the entrenched dysfunctional relationship between urban sectors. So my message this morning is twofold. Firstly, you're not alone. This problem exists in many other parts of South Africa and many other parts of the world. Secondly, you ask at the end of your motion, is there a solution? And you correctly say, yes, there is a solution for a number of ways of addressing this, some of which we've already heard this morning. But there are both theoretical models and practical examples of how to address this problem. And I'm going to touch on a couple of these in my input. Now, what I'm going to say is based both on the one hand, on my own personal experience in the Cape Town Partnership, which is an urban regeneration partnership. More recently in Cape Town, we created a second CBD type partnership that's called the Greater Tygerberg Partnership. And there's some new lessons there. And then more recently, as you heard in the introduction, we've created a Western Cape Economic Development Partnership, which is focused, as its name implies, on getting people to work together on economic growth and job creation over the whole provincial area. So it's not just focusing on a particular space, and therefore is a different type of partnership. But in addition to that experience, which I will refer to, there's also a great deal of South African and global literature and multiple case studies that one can refer to here, both the theory and the practice. So I'm going to focus on how partnerships, or to use a more formal term, how collaborative intermediary organizations, or CIOs, how these can help address two related challenges. And it's come up in your motion and in the other talks this morning. Firstly, how do we work better across sectors, silos, and boundaries? In other words, how do we put into place in practice a whole of society approach? How do we get the correct alignment between markets, plans, and institutions? That's often where we fall short in a lot of our development initiatives. So firstly, working better across the different sectors, and secondly, getting from vision to action. In your motion, you say in one of the sessions there, in spite of good policy, South African cities are still struggling with X, Y, and Z. And that's exactly that. A lot of focus on vision, a lot of focus on strategy, plans, and policies. We tend to fall down on the implementation, on the action side. So how do we translate a vision into action? Let me start off by just trying to answer the question, well, why partnerships? Why do we actually need partnerships in the first place? And I would suggest that this is more than a protocol that is needed, as mentioned in your motion. And there's four reasons really why partnerships are necessary for development. And the first one is that, as we've heard this morning, development is complex and development is messy. And the challenges that we face, whether it's a community or a neighborhood or a metropolitan area or a nation or a global community, is way beyond any single business sector, sphere of government, or discipline's ability to resolve that complexity. We need a whole of society approach rather than just a well-performing or capable state approach, although that's certainly a necessary part of the equation. And in fact, our National Development Plan is based just on this approach. it's not a plan for government. It's a plan for society, for all of us. So the question is, if that's the mandate, if that's the vision, how do we put it into practice? How do we organize a whole of society approach that works? Secondly, cross-sector collaboration has the potential to drive change through a deliberate juxtaposition of opposing and even conflicting interests, ideas, practices, experiences, behaviors, and organizational cultures. And I think you talked about engaging with difference, and that's exactly what it is. If you only talk to the people like you in a narrow discipline or a department or in a university, you're not going to really push the envelope. And it's only when you organize engagement around difference and opposing not just ideas and ideologies, but organizational cultures and institutional cultures and traditions that you can start thinking out of the box. Thirdly, structured partnerships, as opposed to ad hoc or symbolic or occasional encounters or get-togethers between the different sectors, are necessary to create sustainable platforms for dialogue, trust building, and action. And so getting the business leaders and the vice chancellors of the university and the political leaders together for a dinner or a public performance on an occasional or once-off occasion is just not good enough. That's not a partnership. That doesn't sustain anything. That's just confetti. And then fourthly, and I'm going to come back to this point in more detail just now, collaborative intermediary organizations can create a safe in-between space for the creativity, experimentation, and innovation needed to steer and guide decisions. So, those are my arguments for why partnerships are not just a nice to have, but actually should be at the heart of any developmental process if you are taking a whole of society approach as opposed to just a state planning approach or just a market private sector approach. Partnerships, in my experience, do not occur naturally or easily. There are many institutional structures, processes, attitudes, behaviors, cultures, and conventions and traditions that mitigate against partnerships. And you've listed some of them quite clearly in your motion. There are many more. So partnerships need to be deliberately and intentionally organized and sustained. And that requires quite a bit of effort. So let me try and describe what partnerships are. So please don't think traditional PPPs or public-private partnerships in terms of our existing national legislation. These are mechanisms really for raising private finance into public infrastructure, and that's not what I'm talking about now. In my work, we've identified 4 types of partnerships, and you often, in any one development process, need a combination of these. Firstly, we look at how do we organize what we call transversal partnerships. We know in the traditional city council or provincial government, there are all the departmental silos that really struggle to work together. But it's not just a problem of government. How many universities can say that all their departments and faculties easily work together? How many professional disciplines work together? Why do planners regard space as the final frontier for not just humankind but economists? There's a traditional tension between many of the disciplines that in fact are necessary to work together. So transversal partnerships across silos, disciplines, departments, industries, and so on. That's the first type of partnership that one looks to put together. Secondly, intergovernmental partnerships. Perhaps this is the most obvious set of partnerships, but probably some of the most difficult to put together, trying to bring together three spheres of government, as well as all the agencies and state-owned enterprises and development finance institutions that are aligned to the, or supported by the respective spheres of government is not easy. It is like herding cats. And there's a lot of territorial maneuvering around powers and functions. But it has to be done because the instruments and levers, let's say for urban regeneration and urban development, do not simply lie with the city council or just with the provincial government. They lie in a kind of mixture between all three spheres of government. And if you're not bringing those three spheres together, you cannot really have an integrated urban development process. Third set of partnerships that we look at is cross-sector partnerships, public, private, labor, civil society, knowledge institutions, etc. And the fourth type is what we call cross-boundary partnerships. You know the problem when a municipal mandate only extends as far as its boundary and it won't move a foot over this boundary, boundaries become borders, and local municipalities start competing with each other in a race to the bottom. Well, you've got to organize people to think more than the administrative boundary. Think functional region, for example. Think integration of urban and rural spaces. Transversal partnerships, intergovernmental coordination, cross-sector partnerships, and cross-boundary partnerships are what we're talking about here. And in this sense, I've got a slight quibble with the motion, if I may. It focuses on how do you get three sectors together, the architects, and I suppose that means the professional bodies, the academics, and I suppose it means the universities, and the administrators, namely the public sector. And that's well and good, but where are the end users in that mix? And it comes back to a question we were talking about and debating just now, the so-called customers. I don't particularly like that word, but where are the social movements? Where are the NGOs? Where are the community-based organizations? Where are the business associations? Where are the investor bodies? And things like that. They have to be part of that mix. Because that is the full scale of the dynamic that one is dealing with when you're trying to look at city development. Now, if you're interested in partnerships, and I think you are in terms of how you phrased your motion, here are 5 tips for establishing and managing effective partnerships that we've learned over the last 15 years through various types of experience. Firstly, it's useful to combine what I'd call a dialogue partnership with action and implementation. We know that vision without action is just a talk shop, and action without vision is not sustainable and is usually blind. So in a single process, we need to talk about both co-design and co-implementation. How do we get to a shared vision when there are many competing visions in our society? Even more difficult, how do we get to a common agenda when we tend to predicate ourselves around differences rather than what is common? And thirdly, joint action. So it's shared vision, common agenda, joint action. Particularly through demonstration projects, we can illustrate new ways of doing things and build trust amongst partners far easier than sitting down and talking together. Working together, doing things together, learning by doing is a most effective way of building trust and therefore building the partnership. Spending hours and hours talking about a partnership and setting out rules for partnerships is just not the way to go. You've got to get stuck in and work together and experience real life together, and that builds a partnership much quicker. Second tip is really trying to work out a commitment to shared values. It helps you to work together despite differences. You know, of course, you've referred to it this morning, there are many differences in this room, let alone in our whole of society. Nothing wrong with difference. In fact, that's the stuff of society. It's what makes development exciting and messy at the same time. But in South Africa, we tend to say, because we think differently or we come from different traditions and backgrounds and ideologies, we can't work together. We've in fact got to fight each other. And I think that having a system of shared values in a partnership allows you to accommodate difference much better. So some of the shared values, one of our shared values is working together despite differences. That's the rule number one. That difference doesn't mean to say that you can't work together and cooperate. A commitment to information and knowledge sharing. Knowledge is power. You hoard it like mad. You use it to bargain. Not a good thing. Mutual support and accountability. Are architects accountable to society? Is society accountable to architects? City councils, are they accountable to society? Is society accountable? Mutual accountability. Belief in consensus building. Appreciation of independent thought. That's quite a tough one. We often, under the stricture of, let's all think the same, we don't really welcome independent thought. Good governance and ethical behavior. These are some of the shared values that we put at the heart of our partnerships to try and bring people together. The third tip I leave you with is get the right people. And we've actually worked quite a bit. We do a lot of leadership development around partnerships and transition management. And we focus very much on both the capabilities and the competencies of collaborative leadership. Now, I won't go through it all, but for example, you need people that can create a compelling vision that motivates commitment. Not someone who just wants to come and tell you how it is going to be because the law says so or because the mayor says so. You've got to foster joint ownership and responsibility. That's what a leader has to do. Leaders have got to facilitate win-win situations as opposed to lose-lose race to the bottom kind of syndromes. Leaders in particular, collaborative leaders, have to be able to translate divergent perspectives. The public sector speaks a foreign language compared to the private sector, and communities speak a third language which is different from both the public and the private sector. I don't know where professionals fit into that language mix, but people don't understand each other. They talk past each other when they're often talking about the same things. So collaborative leadership have got to be skilled translators. They've got to be shuttle diplomats. They've got to be able to move between the different sectors in order to translate the divergent perspectives and language. Understanding and communicating the big picture. I think that you get what I'm talking about here. When we hire people for partnerships now, you throw away the CV, you throw away the academic qualifications, and you focus on four things. Does this person have a degree of self-awareness? Because you're not going to be able to work with others unless you know yourself. Secondly, do you have a degree of self-management? Because partnerships tend to be non-hierarchical, much flatter structures. You don't wait around for some boss or chief director or captain of industry to come and tell you what to do. It helps partners deliver better on their own mandates. It does not seek to take over or substitute for what partners should be doing. And often this is a controversial thing because when you're dealing with public sector who are elected and have statutory mandates and obligations in terms of law, by entering into a partnership, they sometimes feel that their mandate is being taken away from them and being subsumed by something else and are very resistant to that. And you've got to work through that to say a partnership does not take over the role of the partners. In fact, it is there to help them perform their functions and mandates better, not point fingers and name, blame, and shame. And then finally, final tip here is keep it simple. Avoid elaborate structures and processes. Build in maximum flexibility when you start off, because what you start is going to change within 6 months and certainly look very different in 5 years' time. So if you set it into too rigid a structure, you're not going to have the maneuverability that you need as you expand and do different things. And then get the basics right. all partners really need to do the fundamentals well together before you start trying to do the fancy, complicated stuff. I know in the Cape Town partnership, when we started off in 1999, for 5 years, we just looked at urban management issues, crime and grime, before we started looking at Creative Cape Town programs and education programs, social development programs, and right up to competing and winning World Design Capital bid for 2014. Those were the nice things that came after 5, 6, 7 years hard work of getting the basics in place. Now let me sort of try and draw these things together by saying that a partnership is not an end in itself, but it's a means towards an end. And your motion really talks about these things. You put partnerships together because you want change. You want to go beyond business as usual, the same old stuff, which doesn't seem to be getting anywhere. You want to get beyond that. And you've recognized that. How do you overcome that business as usual inertia? You want both system improvement and system innovation. In other words, you want the existing system to work better, and you want to have new, more innovative systems eventually replace the existing system. And you want to be able to tackle complex and persistent problems. And you've noted some of them that are applicable to city development in South Africa quite clearly and correctly. So I want to leave you with two things which we're not going to have time to go into in depth here. But the first one is what I'd call transition management methodology. There are many types of transitions in societies. We can talk about the urban transition, as your motion does. The transition effective from a rural-based society to an urban-based society over 100 years. That's an urban demographic transition. We can talk about socioeconomic transitions. We can talk about sustainability transitions, getting from a high-carbon society to a low-carbon society over X number of decades. Those are all transitions. And the thing about transitions, transition management consists of a deliberate attempt to steer a transition towards a more desirable future. That's what transition management is all about. That's what, in fact, we are all engaged in here. But transitions are the result of the interplay between many unlike processes. And many of those processes cannot be managed in a traditional sense, because they deal with things like culture and behavior change. So we can influence the speed and direction of a transition through various types of steering and coordination. But I would say that transitions defy control, certainly control in the traditional sense of the word. They can be influenced, but they cannot be controlled. And to steer and guide a transition in society is dependent as much on factors as creativity, perseverance, communication skills, and ability to partner, as opposed to legislation, policy, and command and control type of practices. And it's through transition management methodology that we connect long-term vision to short-term actions. And we've developed a transition management model, which, again, we don't have time to go through here. But in addition to the traditional problem assessment or diagnostic that one does, whether it's the National Development Plan or what you've done here in terms of your motion, it also talks at the same time of creating a transition arena, a multi-actor transition arena, and the identification of a transition manager. So who is going to drive your process? That's your first question. And it's got to be someone in the middle that can bring all the sectors together. If it's one of the players, the other players are going to be unlikely to sort of easily come on board, because everyone starts off by jostling for position. So who's in the middle there? Who are you going to put right in the middle, which can be a lonely and dangerous place, as we know, but it also can be a very exciting place. And that brings me on to my final point here, to re-emphasize the power of the in-between space. A partnership or a collaborative intermediary organization is not a government agency, although it usually works very closely with government agencies, special purpose vehicles. It's not a business association, although it works with them. It's not a university think tank. It's not an NGO. It sits deliberately in between these institutions, providing the space for three things. Firstly, a safe space for dialogue and trust building, where you've got to address issues of identity, belonging, and meaning, both of individuals and of organizations. Secondly, it's a space for experimentation, risk-taking, and innovation. And you yourself have referred in your motion to the difficult process within existing public sector institutions in particular, although I wouldn't exclude big corporates, for example, or universities from this problem of, where do you drive innovation? Because if you cannot take risks, you can't really innovate. And when you are locked into annual performance plans in terms of the PFMA or the MFMA, and to get a qualified audit is a kiss of death on your APP, you deliver not less and not more, but just what is in that plan. And you keep your head down and you don't ask the big questions. And that's the culture of public sector administration that we tend to have in our country. But I would say that it also extends to some of our other institutions. So where are we going to have that experimentation, the risk-taking, the innovation? What it is in when you bring the different institutions together and you create that in-between space where you experiment and innovate, and then you can take the learnings back into those institutions that struggle with those sorts of things. And then finally, an in-between space provides that kind of common platform for action. And this is much more than just better coordination. It's about finding new ways of doing things and actually bringing back new forms of organization and action back into the institutions that are your partners. My final word is we all tend to be prisoners of binary thinking in this country. We kind of urban or we rural development people. We are town versus township. We are sort of economic versus social development. In fact, our public versus private sector. State versus market. Henry, you even talked about capitalist versus socialists. You kind of pro-business or pro-poor. You can't mix those two things together. They're enemies of each other. Big city versus small town. Economists versus planners, etc., etc. These binaries are endless and they are recipes for immobilization because they become an excuse to do nothing. If we cannot overcome the limitations of binary thinking and get to a both-and language, and that is the language of collaboration, it is the language of partnerships, where you welcome differences and you say, yes, we can work together despite coming from different backgrounds, different traditions, different perspectives. And the final point is one that we try and put into practice. It's easier said than done. When you come into a space like this, or any other space, you leave your jackets at the door, the proverbial jackets at the door. We very urgently need to move beyond what I would call distributive or competing forums, where you arrive there firmly with your jacket on. I'm from government. I'm from business. I'm from the professional association. I'm from the union. There you keep your t-shirt on. Maybe it's not your jacket. But you don't take your jackets off and you come into arm wrestle the best deal for your sector. It's negative bargaining space. And it's really typified, I would argue, by the kind of NEDLAC approach that we've entrenched in this country for the last 15 years, where any one party doesn't like what's happening there, they can torpedo a process that needs to move much more to an integrative, collaborating process through building a new common identity And to build a new common identity, you have to take off your existing jacket, your existing identity. I am an architect. I am a city manager. I am a business leader. You've got to take that off when you come into this sort of forum. And you've got to kind of engage as something else, build some other new identity, which can be very threatening to people who rely on their existing identities to kind of exist in the world. Let me issue my closing remarks, issue an invitation. In the Western Cape Economic Development Partnership, the Cape Town Partnership, one of our projects, which is a well-designed Capital 2014 project for next year, is the production of a partnering toolkit dealing with these sort of issues. And don't think a manual, although it may be that, or a checklist. It's a set of modules over the next 12 to 18 months, ranging from design process to using jazz as a metaphor for collaboration in society. So if you're wanting to take a step, as you have concluded in your motion, I invite you to join with us as part of authoring or co-designing that partnering toolkit as you learn by doing and write up your own case study with us. Thank you very much.